The cicadas were louder than usual today. I was sitting by the edge of a dusty riverbank, my feet half buried in the warm sand, watching giant dragonflies skim over the surface like little helicopters. The sun was high and bright, so bright that even the tallest acacia trees couldn't offer much shade. This wasn't the world we know today. There were no cities, no farms, no people anywhere. Just endless savannas, forests that stretched into the unknown, and animals I had never seen before in any science textbook. And in the middle of all this ancient wilderness, there lived a creature, neither man nor monkey, but something strangely familiar. His name was Ouranopithecus. Of course, nobody called him that back then. He didn't even have a name. But scientists would discover his fossil millions of years later and give him that title, trying to piece together who he was. All I knew was what I could see. A large, ape-like figure with powerful arms and long fingers made for climbing trees. His eyes were sharp and constantly alert. The Miocene era was not a peaceful place. Every sound could mean danger. From behind, a patch of tall grass, I watched him move carefully along the edge of a shallow watering hole. He paused to sniff the air. Then he looked around, once to the left, once to the right, before finally leaning down to drink. The water was still, except for tiny tadpoles that darted away the moment his lips touched the surface. Even though he looked relaxed, I could feel it. That constant tension, like a stretched rope about to snap. This was not the kind of world where anything could safely lower its guard. A rustle came from the bushes behind him, but it was just a small antelope, not a predator. The antelope didn't run. It was also thirsty. Ouranopithecus lifted his head, blinked slowly, then went back to drinking. For a brief moment, it almost felt like there was some kind of understanding between them. We both need water. Let's just survive today. Back in those Miocene days, almost 9 million years ago, the climate here in southeastern Europe and Western Asia was changing. What used to be thick tropical forests were becoming more open and dry. The lush green was slowly giving way to patches of shrublands and dry savanna. That meant fewer fruit trees, fewer safe places to hide, and more open ground where danger could approach from any direction. Imagine what that feels like. You've spent your whole life climbing trees, plucking fruits, and resting in high branches where no one can reach you. And suddenly the world is opening up, forcing you to come down from the trees, forcing you to walk farther and farther just to find a meal. It wasn't just the world that was changing. Our ancient relatives had to change too. That's why Ouranopithecus was so special. He wasn't just one more ape living among many others. He was part of an important turning point. I decided to follow him from a distance. He moved slowly but confidently toward a cluster of fig trees that were still green despite the dry season. But he wasn't alone. Up in the branches, a troop of smaller monkeys were already feeding, dropping half-eaten figs onto the ground as they jumped from branch to branch. Normally, that wouldn't bother him. He was much bigger and stronger, but the branch creaked loudly when he tried to climb up. He stopped. His weight was too heavy for the thinner branches that supported the smaller monkeys, and while he still had the hands of a tree climber, his body had grown more massive, more suited for short walks across tough ground than for swinging gently through the canopy. So he did something interesting, something kind of clever. He didn't climb up at all. Instead, he patiently stayed under the tree, waiting for the others to drop more figs. Whenever one fell, he picked it up quickly before anything else could grab it. One by one, the fruits kept falling, and one by one he collected them without wasting any energy. It wasn't graceful or heroic, but it worked. For the first time, I realized something. Our distant ancestors didn't always survive by being the strongest or fastest. Sometimes they survived by being smart and adapting when their environment changed. A few meters away, a loud growl suddenly echoed across the savanna. It came from a gigantic amphibian, one of those terrifying bear dogs that were part bear, part giant dog. Its massive body was covered in thick fur, and its powerful legs kicked up clouds of dust as it chased after a struggling herbivore in the distance. The chase ended quickly. A sharp scream, then silence. Ouranopithecus froze. He stood completely still for several seconds, listening. The world around him seemed to hold its breath. Even the monkeys stopped moving for a moment. This was survival. It wasn't a big battle or a dramatic escape. It was a careful calculation. If the predator had noticed him, he wouldn't have had a chance. So instead of running in panic and making noise, he stood still. No movement, no sound. Just waiting for the predator to leave. After a few tense moments, he slowly crouched down and moved into a patch of thicker vegetation. Every muscle in his body moved silently. He didn't run until he was certain the danger had passed. Later, that afternoon, I watched him climb up an old fig tree where a thicker branch finally offered enough support. There he sat for a while, staring at the golden horizon. The sky over the Miocene savanna was unlike anything I had ever seen. Huge, endless, pink and orange, with flocks of prehistoric birds flying far above. I wondered if he had any idea how important he was. Probably not. To him, each day was just about finding food, water, and avoiding teeth and claws. But from where I sat, millions of years away, he looked like someone standing at the beginning of a very long journey. A journey that would eventually lead to us. And even though he never spoke a word, his actions told me something very clear. To survive in a changing world, you must change with it. That day ended quietly. Ouranopithecus curled up on a thick branch and rested his head against the trunk. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the savanna softened into evening whispers. Somewhere far away, another predator called out as the first stars began to appear. I looked at his sleeping form and felt a strange mix of awe and sadness. He would never know how important his small decisions were. He would never know that millions of years later, a boy would tell his story, sitting at the edge of time, trying to understand where we came from. And this was only the beginning. The next morning came without warning. No gentle breeze, no soft bird call, just a dry, scorching sun that rose like a burning coin over the horizon. By the time light touched the ground, the grass was already crackling under its heat. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and climbed back to my usual lookout point near the old fig tree. Ouranopithecus was already awake. He wasn't resting today. His eyes looked different now, more focused, as if something important had shifted overnight. I followed his gaze across the empty savanna and realized why. The nearest stream had completely dried up. What was yesterday a shallow line of muddy water was now just cracked earth, split open like broken pottery. Small fish were stranded in tiny puddles, gasping as the sun climbed higher. There was no water left here. Ouranopithecus didn't hesitate. He stepped away from the broken riverbed and began walking. Not wandering. Walking. With purpose. The dry season in the late Miocene wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a force of nature that decided who would live and who would vanish forever. It pushed every creature to the edge, forcing them to leave safe territories and travel deeper and deeper into unfamiliar land. Some would find water. Many would. Not Ouranopithecus passed a group of gazelles clustered under a lone acacia tree. Their ribs were showing. Even they seemed too exhausted to run. One of them lifted its head to watch him for a moment, then lowered it again as if even fear required too much energy now. Ouranopithecus didn't bother them. He just kept moving. Hours passed. The sun kept rising and burning everything beneath it. Just when I thought he might have miscalculated, a faint sound reached us. Drip, drip, drip. There, hidden behind a cluster of boulders, was a small shaded cave, and at the base of that cave wall, A thin trickle of water slowly slid down, gathering in a shallow basin carved by centuries of erosion. It wasn't much. It could barely fill a cupped hand, but to him, it was everything. He crouched down and drank quietly. No rushing, no panic. Just slow, steady sips. That's when I noticed something else. Footprints, fresh ones. Someone, or something, had been here not long ago. The prints were bigger than his, rounder, with claw marks pressed deep into the mud. My chest tightened. It was a Machairodus, a massive saber-toothed cat, the kind of predator that didn't chase. It waited, silent, patient, and deadly. Ouranopithecus didn't react at first. He took one last sip of water and sat back, eyes narrowing as he examined the tracks. He was reading them like a story carved into the ground. Then, he slowly stood up and moved away from the cave, never turning his back fully on it. Instead of heading toward the open plains, he shifted toward a cluster of fallen trees, a tangled maze of trunks and branches. It was tight, messy, and difficult to navigate, but that was the point. A predator the size of a saber-tooth would struggle to move quietly in that narrow space. Ouranopithecus climbed into the mess of wood, spreading his weight carefully across several branches. He stopped only when he reached the thickest part in the center, where the branches formed something like a natural fortress. He crouched there, half hidden, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Then, a single leaf fell from above, twirling in the air before landing silently near his foot. Ouranopithecus didn't even flinch, but I saw his eyes flick toward the direction it came from. Something else was in those trees. High above, hidden by the leaves, a young Dryopithecus clung to one of the upper branches, smaller, quicker, and clearly terrified. She must have seen the saber-toothed cat earlier and climbed here to escape. Now she was stuck, too scared to move, too tired to climb back down. Ouranopithecus looked up at her. The young Dryopithecus stared, back, frozen in place, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. He tilted his head slightly, then reached out and broke off a large branch. Very slowly, he held it up toward her, as if offering a bridge. At first, she didn't move. Then, trembling, she inched forward across the makeshift path he provided. Every second felt like an eternity. One wrong move and she would fall. But she made it. She climbed down the branch until she reached the safe center where Ouranopithecus waited. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was strange. Two very different apes sharing a tiny island of safety in a sea of danger. The young Dryopithecus sat next to him, breathing heavily, but her eyes gradually softened. She wasn't alone anymore. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled somewhere in the tall grass beyond the fallen trees. The saber-tooth had arrived. Its massive head emerged slowly from the grass, nostrils twitching as it picked up their scent. Those long, curved fangs flashed in the sunlight. For a brief moment, it locked eyes with Ouranopithecus. The air felt like it stopped moving, but it didn't attack. It circled the perimeter, searching for an opening. But all it found were narrow gaps between thick branches, too tight for its large body. It snarled, frustrated, pacing back and forth outside the fortress of fallen wood. Inside, Ouranopithecus remained completely still, keeping his large body between the predator and the smaller Dryopithecus. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He simply positioned himself like a shield. Minutes passed. The predator eventually gave up and disappeared back into the tall grass, its growl fading into the distance. The young Dryopithecus exhaled sharply, almost like a sigh of relief. Ouranopithecus waited a bit longer to be sure it was gone, then gently nudged her toward a safer path through the trees. She followed. They didn't stay together long. Once they reached another grove where other Dryopithecus were gathered, the Young one scrambled toward them and disappeared into the group. She looked back only once. Ouranopithecus gave a brief nod and continued his journey alone, heading farther west, toward a place where clouds gathered above the distant hills. I watched him walk away as the sun began its slow descent. Something inside me understood. Even in a time where survival was everything, compassion had a place. Not every victory in the Miocene was about strength. Sometimes it was about helping another survive, even if they were not your kind. And as the wind finally started to cool, I realized that this wasn't just history. It was the beginning of what would one day become humanity. The sky looked different today, like it had been brushed with long streaks of gray paint. The first clouds in weeks were finally drifting over the Miocene landscape, carrying with them the faint promise of rain. It wasn't enough to cool the ground yet, but every creature seemed to notice the change. Birds flew lower, insects became restless, and Ouranopithecus, he started to move faster. He had left the dry savanna behind and was now making his way toward a distant chain of limestone hills. Between those hills lay something precious, a seasonal river that only appeared when the rains came. Most of the year it remained dry, but if the clouds were gathering, there was a chance, just a chance, that water had already begun to flow. As the day grew older, I realized this wasn't just a search for water. It was something else, a migration. A long journey away from familiar ground into territory he hadn't visited in a very long time, or maybe ever. The ground beneath his feet changed. Hard earth gave way to patches of rocky soil and scattered shrubs. Thorny bushes scratched his legs as he passed, leaving thin red lines on his skin, but he barely reacted. He climbed over boulders, pushed through tangled vegetation, and kept going. Even when thunder rumbled in the far distance like some ancient drum, he didn't pause. At one point, he came across the carcass of a large herbivore, what was left of it. Bones, mostly, cleaned by scavengers and bleached white by the sun. He crouched beside it, not out of hunger but curiosity. He gently touched one of the large bones, ran his fingers along its smooth surface, and then moved on. Maybe he was reading another story, one that warned him how fragile life had become around here. Hours passed. Finally, the smell of wet earth carried through the air. He lifted his head and sniffed. The wind brought with it the most important message of all. Rain had fallen somewhere up ahead. He quickened his pace. Soon the ground dipped into a shallow valley, and there it was, a thin, glittering ribbon of water flowing gently between rocky banks. It wasn't deep, it wasn't wide, but it was alive. Dragonflies danced above it, and small amphibians sang their primitive songs from the muddy edges. Ouranopithecus stepped into the river and let the cool water wash over his bruised feet. He crouched down and drank until his thirst was finally satisfied. For the first time in days, his shoulders relaxed, but this wasn't just a place to drink. It was a place to rest. He stepped out of the water and moved toward a patch of tall reeds near the bank. There, hidden beneath the foliage, was a flat area of soft ground shaded by large ferns. Carefully, he gathered a few dry branches and leaves, arranging them in a loose pile before lying down on top of them. It wasn't a nest in the trees like before. It was the first attempt at something new, a sleeping place on the ground. At first, I felt nervous. Ground-level sleep was dangerous. Predators roamed at night, and without the height of a tree, there was little protection. But the more I watched, the more I understood why he chose this spot. The reeds formed a natural wall on one side, and the river formed a barrier on the other. Only one small pathway led in. It was a place that could be defended if needed. He didn't fall asleep right away. Instead, he gathered more branches and pressed them against the narrow entrance. Not a wall exactly, but close. The first traces of a shelter. As the light began to fade, something unexpected happened. A group of small mammals, early relatives of modern civets, approached the river. They paused when they saw him, unsure whether to run or stay. Ouranopithecus didn't move. He simply watched them with calm eyes. Eventually, the civets began to drink, keeping a cautious distance. One of them, a young one, accidentally slipped into the shallow water and splashed around frantically. Ouranopithecus slowly extended his arm and nudged it back toward the riverbank with the back of his hand. No grabbing, no chasing. Just a gentle push. The small civet scurried away once it reached solid ground, but before disappearing, it turned briefly and looked at him, almost as if trying to understand why he helped. And that was when the first raindrop fell, then another, and another. Within moments, a soft, steady rain began to fall over the valley. The leaves shivered as the water touched them. The river swelled just a little, its surface trembling with each new drop. Ouranopithecus lifted his head and let the rain fall across his face. He blinked, almost surprised by how it felt, then closed his eyes and remained completely still. It felt like the whole world was breathing again. The dry season had not been broken completely, but it had been interrupted. And sometimes, in a harsh world, even a brief pause can mean survival. Night rolled in, winding its dark fingers around the valley. The rain softened into a light drizzle. In his small shelter of reeds and branches, Ouranopithecus curled up and finally slept. His breathing deepened. In the half-light, he almost looked peaceful. I sat nearby and listened to the gentle sound of flowing water. For a moment, it was easy to forget how dangerous the world still was. But I also understood something important. This was more than a journey for survival. It was the quiet beginning of settling, choosing a place not just to pass through, but to stay, to protect, to shape into something safe. A place that could one day become home, and although he didn't know it, that decision would change everything. Morning arrived quietly. No roaring predators, no hunting cries, just the soft rustling of wet leaves being nudged by a cool breeze. The rain had stopped during the night, and the Miocene valley looked refreshed. Tiny droplets still clung to. The fern leaves, glittering in the early light like scattered stars that had fallen from the sky. Ouranopithecus woke slowly. He sat up, rubbed the back of his neck, and looked around as if checking to make sure the world hadn't completely changed. While he slept, the river was still there. The reeds still stood like guards around his small shelter. For the first time in a long while, there was no urgency in his eyes. But a few moments later, something caught his attention. A distant sound, soft, rhythmic, too even to be random. It came from farther upstream. He stood up and followed it cautiously along the riverbank, stepping over fallen branches and pushing aside low-hanging vines. After a short walk, the trees opened up into a wider clearing, and that's when he saw them, a small group of Gracopithecus. They were larger than Dryopithecus, but smaller than him, social apes with strong jaws and heavy brows. 3 of them stood on the river's edge, using smooth stones to crack open shells from freshwater snails. One would pick up a snail, place it on a flat rock, and another would strike it with a rounded stone. Crack. The shell broke neatly and the soft body inside was pulled out and eaten. I watched from behind a tree and felt a strange mix of surprise and admiration. This wasn't random behavior. This was simple tool use, passed on from one individual to another. One of the juveniles struggled to crack open a snail, hitting it repeatedly with little success, until an older Gracopithecus gently moved him aside and demonstrated the right angle and force. The juvenile tried again, and succeeded. Ouranopithecus stayed at the edge of the clearing, observing silently. He didn't interrupt. He didn't approach. He just watched, as if recognizing that something important was happening. Eventually, one of the Ouranopithecus noticed him. Their eyes met. For a long moment, no one moved. The juvenile froze, still holding a stone in his hand. The adults stood, slowly positioning themselves between Ouranopithecus and the younger one. Their posture wasn't aggressive, but it was clear. "We're ready to defend ourselves if needed." Ouranopithecus didn't challenge them. Instead, he lowered his head ever so slightly, a subtle gesture, but enough to signal he meant no harm. Then he took a slow step backward, and another, and quietly returned to the reeds near his shelter. It wasn't fear. It was respect. Back near his campsite, he sat beside the river and watched the water flow past, lost in thought. I couldn't hear his thoughts, of course, but it felt like he had just witnessed something that would stay with him. Another kind of ape using simple tools to access food in a changing world. Maybe even working together to teach one another. A soft chirping sound pulled him out of his contemplation. High above, a bright green Miocene parrot hopped from branch to branch, tilting its head in curiosity. It had a cracked nut clutched in, its claws, likely dropped from the tree above. As it bit into the nut, pieces of the shell fell to the forest floor. Ouranopithecus watched as if a quiet idea had formed in his mind. He stood up and began to search the ground. After a few minutes, he found what he was looking for. A small, rounded stone. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, then carried it to a flat patch of rock beside the river. From the ground nearby, he gathered fallen almonds from a wild nut tree, hard-shelled and normally difficult to open. He placed one on the flat rock, raised the stone, brought it down. Crack, the shell broke. For a second, he almost looked surprised. He picked up the exposed nut and ate it, then did it again, and again. Each time his movement grew more controlled, more confident. It wasn't just imitation, it was learning from what he'd seen, from what he'd felt, from what the environment was offering. By midday, a small pile of cracked shells had formed beside him. He seemed satisfied, not just full, but proud, like he had unlocked a new solution to an old problem. Later, while drinking from the river, he noticed movement upstream. Again. The group of Ouranopithecus were leaving, slowly making their way back into the forest. The juvenile paused for a moment, looking back downriver. From where he stood, he could just barely see Ouranopithecus holding his stone. Their eyes met once more. This time, the juvenile didn't hide behind the adults. Instead, he gave a quick nod, almost like a tiny salute, before disappearing into the trees. Ouranopithecus watched them go. That afternoon, he gathered a few more stones and placed them near his reed shelter, arranging them into a small pile. Then he sat beside them, as if guarding something valuable. The river continued to whisper beside him. Birds sang in the freshly washed trees. The valley had become more than just a temporary refuge. It had become a place of learning, of exchange, of quiet inspiration between different beings trying to survive in a challenging world. Not through conquest, but through observation, respect, and adaptation. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the reeds, I realized something simple but powerful, even before there were humans. The sun rose slow and heavy, as if reluctant to leave the horizon. Thin mist floated above the river, turning the valley into a glowing silver dream. Ouranopithecus stepped out of his reed shelter and stretched, the damp morning air clinging to his thick fur. His pile of stones was still there. He crouched beside it and ran his fingers across the smooth surface of his favorite one. It wasn't just a rock anymore. It was part of a new habit, a reliable way to open food when the trees grew empty and the season turned cruel again. For a moment, he simply stared at it, as if sensing the weight of a discovery he couldn't name. But peaceful mornings in the Miocene never lasted long. A sudden rustle came from the tall grass behind him, not the soft flutter of small mammals or birds. This was heavier, slower, controlled. Ouranopithecus straightened and turned his head, just enough to listen without giving away his awareness. Another rustle. Then, silence. Something was approaching. He walked calmly toward the river, but his ears stayed trained on the movement behind him. Instead of drinking, he stepped onto a flat boulder at the water's edge and crouched, pretending to look at the flowing current. In reality, he was watching the reflection on the surface. That's when he saw it. A large silhouette creeping through the tall grass. Dark fur, broad shoulders, predatory patience. Machairodus again, the same. Saber-toothed species that had stalked him in Dryopithecus days earlier. Only this one was larger. Ouranopithecus didn't panic. Instead, he slowly reached down and picked up one of the cracked almond shells from the ground. He tossed it into the river. The splash drew the predator's attention, and for a brief moment, their eyes met in the reflection. The saber-tooth froze, then crouched lower. The hunt had begun. But instead of running across the open valley, Ouranopithecus took a different path. He moved perpendicular to the river, slipping into a tight cluster of dense shrubs and fallen branches that grew, thicker as they climbed toward a rocky ridge, the same kind of terrain that had saved him before. He moved quickly but without haste. Every footstep was placed carefully, avoiding dry twigs and loose stones. The predator followed, trying to circle around and cut him off before he reached the ridge. Halfway up the incline, Ouranopithecus paused beside a large, heavy branch fallen from an ancient tree. Still half attached to the trunk, it formed a kind of narrow passage. Ouranopithecus stepped inside and crouched behind it. The saber-tooth appeared at the base of the ridge, sniffing the air. Its ears twitched. It took slow steps forward, paws sinking softly into the damp soil. The predator lowered its head and entered the narrow passage, one heavy step at a time. Ouranopithecus didn't move, didn't blink, waited. The predator inched closer, muscles coiled like springs beneath its fur. Its head passed under the mane section of the heavy branch. And that's when Ouranopithecus surged forward. With all his strength, he pushed down on the thick end of the fallen branch. The wood, already dead and cracked from age, gave in with a thunderous snap. The other end swung down like a crude lever and struck the saber-tooth directly across its neck and shoulder. The predator roared in shock and pain, stumbling backward, trying to regain balance. But the branch collapsed fully this time, pinning its forelimb against the ground. Ouranopithecus didn't stay to watch. He leapt over the broken wood and sprinted up the ridge without looking back. His breath was heavy, his heart thundered, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning every path ahead. Only when he reached the top did he finally stop. From there, he looked down over the valley. The saber-tooth, shaken and wounded, limped away into the tall grass, growling furiously but no longer hunting. Ouranopithecus stood there for a long time, breathing hard, rain-soaked fur glistening in the morning light. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he looked awakened. He didn't survive the hunt by chance. He survived because he used the land, the fallen branch, the narrow path, the terrain itself, as a weapon. Not by brute strength alone, but by understanding how to turn the world into an ally. Slowly, he descended the ridge again and returned to the riverbank. The stones were still there, waiting. He sat down and placed one hand atop the pile, as if anchoring himself to this new chapter of his life. A familiar chirp echoed above. The same green parrot from earlier watched him from a tree, tilting its head as if amused. A few cracked nuts lay scattered near its perch, a reminder of yesterday's lesson. Ouranopithecus smiled. not with his mouth, but with his eyes. Then he picked up a stone, placed another almond on the flat rock, and cracked it open. In the distance, thunder rumbled again. Not the kind that brings storms, but the kind that signals the earth is shifting, mountains are rising, seasons are changing. The Miocene world was evolving, and so was he.